Well, welcome all this afternoon. Welcome to New York City Climate Week, and welcome to National Grid. I'm very excited to have you all here. My name is Sandy Taft, and I'm the Director of Environmental Policy and Sustainability for National Grid, and I just have some opening remarks to share with you all today. Let's add this. Okay, I don't have to start over, right? Okay. So what I'd like to do is first introduce National Grid. Most of you in the room, some I recognize, not everybody, but hopefully you do know who National Grid is. We're a global company based in the UK. We provide energy in the UK as well as in the US. And I have a brief high-level video that I'd like to share with you. Can you help me with that? This is a video that I think is very fitting for Climate Week. It kind of gives you a feel for our vision for the future, which we call Connect 21.
Sitting on 20th century infrastructure.
I saw a line Thomas Edison built into us.
Climate change is real.
We have a solution.
We have to transition our communities and our local economies into a mix of solar, wind, biogas, and hydro.
To get there, we need to use less through greater energy efficiency and cleaner fuels.
Connect 21 is National Grid's strategy for building 21st century gas and electricity networks in the U.S.
Connect 21 is the bridge to the future.
This is what creating the future.
Microgrids,
Renewables,
Smart technologies, energy efficiency.
Connect 21 is Riverbend, Buffalo, New York.
A reclaimed brownfield will be the site of the largest solar manufacturing facility in the Western Hemisphere.
National Grid has been very focused and very supportive of the economic development needs in Buffalo.
Connect 21's convenience, simple choices, and greater control.
Connect 21 is microgrids.
Connect 21 is partnering with communities to keep the lights on.
Connect 21 is innovative and it's new.
Connect 21 is the sustainability hub, Worcester, Massachusetts.
The Sustainability Hub is the first place of its kind where our customers can actually walk in and off the street and learn about energy efficiency and smart technologies that are now emerging in the market.
There's an app for that.
Connect 21 is energy efficiency.
Every business class is eligible for our energy efficiency programs.
We get the triple win of lowering monthly bills and reducing carbon emissions and creating jobs.
Connect 21 is sustainable energy future.
Connect 21 is Newtown Creek.
By partnering with National Grid, we can take advantage of the anaerobic digesters that already produce biogas, clean it up, and put it into the natural gas distribution system.
Connect 21, National Grid's commitment to create a new energy network to better serve our customers' demands in the 21st century and beyond.
It's all about the future.
This is not theory, this is life, this is real, this is who we are.
Connect 21 is National Grid.
We are National Grid. We are here with you, here for you.
Nothing like taking advantage of video technology to help spread the word. So today and this week, we're talking about climate change. We're talking about Climate Week. We're talking about the road to Paris. You've heard a little bit about Connect 21. Steve Holliday, our CEO, did a really nice piece back in August in the Telegraph, and we can get the link out to you all afterwards. But he focused about what does business need to do with regard to this climate change challenge? What do we have to do on the road to Paris and coming up to Paris? And had four main points to that. The first one was, a little bit tongue-in-cheek, Business, don't go there. There's going to be way too many people. Let the delegates do what they need to do and let them negotiate what they need to negotiate. But his 2 or 3 other points really are spot on. One is being supportive of government policy, of which National Grid, both in the UK and in the US, have been very supportive. For example, here in the US, very supportive of the Clean Power Plan, very supportive of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and very supportive of innovative approaches like were mentioned in this video. Also, he mentioned number 3, lead in innovation. Again, those are highlighted in that talk, or on the video rather. And then inspiration was his final point. So what more fitting remarks by Steve than really to introduce what we're going to talk about today, which is something that is very innovative indeed, very much thinking in the future, very much science-oriented, and please challenge our audience, our panelists if they get too science down the road for you and bring them back. But most importantly, I hope it will inspire you. I hope this conversation will inspire you, and I hope it will also inspire you all to ask many questions of the panelists. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Christoph Jost, Chief Strategist for the Center for Negative Carbon Emissions at Arizona State University. He is going to be our moderator today, and he founded the center in August of 2014 with air capture pioneer Klaus Lachner and Alan Wright, and he leads the center's business development and communication efforts. Previously, he had been working with Klaus and Alan at the Lundfest Center for Sustainable Energy at Columbia University, and that's where Don Chapazapor of National Grid first met them and started this dialogue some years ago. He holds a Master of Public Administration from Columbia School of International and Public Affairs and Environmental Science, and a policy and a BA from Colgate University. Please help me welcome Christoph. Oops. Which one do I speak to?
Thank you, Sandy. And thank you, everyone at National Grid, for helping to put this event together, and everyone in the audience for coming. And I hear that the live stream is working well, so hello to everyone listening virtually. And I'd also like to thank the panelists for agreeing to be here today. And lastly, I want to thank my boss and mentor, Klaus Lachner, who over the last 3 years has put me on an incredibly fast learning curve to connect the dots on how to take a concept and put it into reality. So to frame this conversation a little bit, what is the problem? I hope that I don't need to convince anyone in this room that climate change is real. And we know it's real because carbon dioxide accumulates in the atmosphere, and it accumulates because we're burning fossil energy to get energy. And for every ton of fossil-based energy that is introduced into the atmosphere, another ton must be put away. And this is some basic science that I think increasingly people are coming around to, most explicitly the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which in its latest report has said, if we have any hope for addressing the most severe effects of climate change, we need prolonged periods of negative emissions. The problem is that current paradigms and investments are only talking about how to reduce emissions, and reduction is not enough. So direct air capture, and sometimes referred to as air capture, and I hope to not confuse you, and we might use the two interchangeably, is a technology that can pull carbon dioxide out of the air. And broadly, this is done in 3 steps. It's a process that can contact the air and absorb the carbon dioxide, release the carbon dioxide from that contactor, and then regenerate the contactor so that it can do the job all over again. This can be driven by moisture, it can be driven by heat, it can be driven by pressure, it can be driven by a combination of all of those and some chemical engineering. What it does is it creates a stream of carbon dioxide that can be used to either be recycled, and we'll learn more about that today, or disposed of. And that's where we get into talking about negative emissions. This is not flue gas capture. So conventional carbon capture and storage is looking at a stream of carbon dioxide that's coming out of a flue gas, whether that's burning coal or natural gas or cement, and it's significantly higher concentration, and it's in one spot, and you have to capture all of it. It's similar, and there's similar ways to use that carbon dioxide, but it's different. It's also not a tree. And this technology has been loosely coined artificial trees by some, and in a way, it mimics nature's process of photosynthesis, because it uses the natural carbon dioxide that's in the air, take it out, and it can also use sunlight to feed the energy to make this process work. So some of the advantages of direct air capture is that it can close the carbon cycle. And by that, I mean get us to carbon neutrality, or zero. Carbon neutral processes are those that do not introduce new fossil-based energy into the air, but rather can keep doing what they're doing without that. Carbon neutral processes can also be considered carbon neutral if you can prove that a ton of fossil-based energy is now put away. So if we can figure out how to capture the carbon dioxide and get rid of it, for all intents and purposes, that's closed the carbon cycle. Now, this technology has been considered a technological fix. And there are 3 criteria that it satisfies in order to become some. First, it connects the problem to the solution. By that, the problem, simply put, is that there's too much carbon dioxide in the air. If we can figure out how to take it out of the air, we're directly connected to the problem. The second is it's unambiguous in the metric. We know how much carbon dioxide is taken out, and that allows us to think about scalability. And lastly, it's technologically feasible. We're not talking any longer about a science experiment. We're talking about something where people are putting on hard hats and can see that the process is actually working, and more research and development will lead to decisive improvements and cost reductions. And another key point as I think about how to motivate doing more, and as I put my policy hat on, is that removal motivates reduction. And by that, I mean if we figure out how to pull carbon dioxide out of the air and get rid of it, and suddenly know what that costs, all of the other processes that can reduce carbon emissions, which those attending Climate Week may hear about, that include efficiency improvements, or renewable energy, or carpooling, or any number of actions that you can take that lower or keep the carbon in the ground, well, if you suddenly have to pay for them, you'll be more likely to do those things more quickly. So that makes them motivated. So what is this? What can you do with carbon dioxide? Well, a lot of things, and we'll hear about that today, and we have a select few panelists who are going to speak about that. But to just gloss over the industry as a whole, I would say this is a new business ecosystem that evolves from being able to economically pull carbon dioxide out of the air. This spans foods, whether we're feeding carbon dioxide into greenhouses to enhance the bio yield, or feeding it into beverages, to carbonate beverages, or even keeping beer fresh. Fuels, and there are 2 pathways. This can either be a biological pathway to feed algae and make a biofuel, or to make a synthetic fuel, which requires a feedstock of carbon dioxide, water, zapping both of them with electricity, and you have the C's, O's, and H's to build methanol. Or fibers. We can make stuff out of carbon dioxide, whether that's plastics or materials or even cloth. It's industrial gases. You might not know that certain dry cleaners will use carbon dioxide to drive their process. Enhanced oil recovery is another rather large process that uses carbon dioxide from air. And in this case, as in all of the other cases, if we can mine carbon dioxide from the air, because it exists everywhere, we don't need to worry about getting it to the desired source. As it relates to enhanced oil recovery, this means that you can be directly over an oil field and injecting the carbon dioxide underground. And lastly, and the reason I have this in red, is because we want to get good at pulling carbon dioxide out of the air because we need to sequester it, and we need to sequester a lot of it. Right now, we're emitting about 36 billion tons of carbon dioxide each year. And in order to deliver negative emissions on the requisite scale, we'll probably need to be pulling 36 billion tons out of the air each year to really drive down the total concentrations of carbon dioxide. So this requires 2 steps. It requires a way to efficiently pull it out of the air and a way to efficiently get rid of it. So today's panelists, and as I introduce you, please come up on stage. starts with Donald Shabazpour, and Donald is a fellow SEPA alum. He's currently a director at National Grid's Network Strategy and in the Utility of the Future department, and he's leading the company's efforts in addressing sustainability issues in the natural gas business, mainly focusing on directly engaging stakeholders such as the Environmental Protection Agency, Department of Energy, White House, industry associations to support the administration's effort to reduce methane emissions from the natural gas distribution sector. Don's also responsible for raising awareness. We saw him on the video earlier today, and engaging policymakers regarding the potential of a renewable natural gas. And lastly, he represents the company on the New York City Climate Change Adaptation Task Force. Next, I'd like to welcome Cece Liu. Cece is the Director of Business Development at Joule and a pioneer in the direct conversion of CO2 to fuels. Joule's process uses carbon dioxide as its feedstock for the production of clean and renewable drop-in hydrocarbon fuels. So this is a pathway that's meant to reverse and close the loop of the combustion process. The company is building plants that are adjacent to industrial waste carbon dioxide emitters in the first stage of commercial deployment. And in the long term, it sees air capture as a viable partner because it provides the opportunity to scale and site plants globally, because this allows you to go, and I'm sure we'll hear more about it, in the places where it's sunniest, because we can now just pull carbon dioxide out of the air. Next, I'd like to welcome Frank O'Keefe. And Frank is a longtime friend of Klaus, as well as the Lenfest Center for Sustainable Energy. He recounts this vivid story when it was in the middle of January, freezing cold, and he met Klaus, and the conversation went on for 2 hours, and Frank didn't have a jacket, but he was so excited by this technology. And he is currently involved with an effort called Infinitry, which is a benefit corporation. And benefit corporations, for those who aren't aware, respond to the triple bottom line and really considers people, planet, and profit. And this startup company creates a sustainable feedstock of carbon dioxide that can be used in greenhouses. Lastly, I'd like to welcome Peter Eisenberger. Now, Peter is a professor at Columbia University in Earth and Environmental Science. He is also a physicist. He and Klaus are buddies and can speak on an incredibly theoretical level that will lose me very quickly. But nonetheless, he is the chief technology officer for a company called Global Thermostat, which uses a different process to capture carbon dioxide out of the air, and will speak about his perspective and provide some very valuable insight. So without further ado, I'll join these panelists. Do I still need this mic? And can we, or maybe we'll just speak loudly.
I think we're all hooked up.
Yeah, we're all hooked up, and this is for our internet friends.
Right.
So if we could go down the line, the first question is, how did you get here today? And if you could tell the story of why you think you're sitting on stage.
Sure. So in 2009, National Grid created a sustainable group within the gas distribution department. The original focus was to talk about renewable natural gas. When you think about renewables, you think about solar and wind, but we thought there's an opportunity that no one's talking about. You saw that in the video. That was the Newtown Creek. And we were also thinking about resiliency, and I give a lot of credit to our executives. We were talking about resiliency of the gas network in 2009. That was a few years before Sandy. And then also thinking about climate change. So I wanted to personally to have do a deeper dive into the science of climate change. What is actually climate change? And that led me to the Earth Institute. I started reading the white papers and the research reports from Columbia. And that was the same time that the Waxman Marquee got passed. And if you recall, at that time, around 2009, people were thinking when Waxman Marquee got passed that there would be a cap and trade about CO2. So we had a project that we were actually thinking about, and we got to meet Klaus. So I had also had one of those sessions where I spend a few hours talking to Klaus about it. And I just want to capture the science in about like 60 seconds because I think it sets the context for this conversation, and I think that's something that the audience will really appreciate. But in a nutshell, over the last 100 years, we have put about 500 gigatons of CO2 in the atmosphere, carbon, 500 billion cubic tons. About 2/3 of that, 350 to 400 tons of that, is coming from burning fossil fuel. The rest of it is deforestation. Out of the 500, 2/3 has gone into the air. You've heard a lot being talked about that the CO2 concentration was around 280, 300 about 100 years ago, and it's now 400 ppm, and it's going up by 2 ppm per year, which is fully explained by fossil fuels. You've heard a lot about what the impact is, right? Climate change, more frequent storms, powerful storms, and the floods. The other third has actually been not talked about a lot. So what's happened to the other third? The other third of that 500 has gone into the oceans. And over the last 100 years, the acidity of the ocean has dropped from 8.2 to 8.1. That's a log scale. That means the oceans today are 30% more acidic than they were 100 years ago. And that number is projected to go to 7.8 by 2100 and 8.0 by 2050. We have not heard a lot about this in the media, but the impact would actually be more profound than climate. It impacts the way coral reefs and the way the ocean generates carbonates. It impacts the ecosystem of the ocean. So that was, when I went through that and when I looked at the way we talked about it at the utility, is we're always talking about, reducing our carbon footprint, we're reducing our emissions. And it turns out, as I learned from, going through this journey at the Earth Institute, is if all the things that utilities are talking about, and it's a portfolio of things, you saw them in the video, all the renewables, energy efficiency, grid scale storage, if they all become commercially available tomorrow and they're cheap and we implement them, we do not solve the problem of climate change. Because half of the CO2 is coming from distributed resources. It's cars, airplanes, your natural gas when you're using it in your house, your oven, that's distributed. And what I also learned was that about a year ago, the latest IPCC report went beyond saying we need to be carbon neutral. We actually have to go negative emissions, which means we have to pull the carbon out of the air. We're essentially cleaning up the mess that we've created over the last 100 years. And the only way you can go towards negative emissions is through air capture. So it was the combination of the science and meeting Klaus and talking about a technology that essentially led me to this place today.
Thanks, Don.
So how did I come to be on this panel? Joule was started in 2007 by a venture capital firm called Flagship Ventures in Cambridge, Massachusetts. At the time, it was kind of amid this trend in clean tech. Obviously, there's a lot of concern around climate change to motivate this creation of a company. But it was also this idea of making a fuel that didn't necessarily have to come from a petroleum source. As Don already alluded to, there's a lot of emissions being put into the air, the atmosphere, and about 15 to 20% of that comes from the transportation sector. And when you look at the solutions out there, there's just, you can continue to burn fossil fuel, then you just keep putting CO2 into the atmosphere. At the time, there were some solutions from corn-based ethanol production to what's called the next generation, or currently called the second generation of biofuels, cellulosic fuels. And the problem if you look at it, is that there are just so many steps that have to be taken in the processing of biomass to get to the fuel that you can then kind of blend into the fuel system. So Flagship saw this opportunity to really think about how do we get around these issues of competing with food crops, competing with land use, and really come up with a really direct solution to the problem. And that's when they came across this idea of direct conversion using photosynthesis. So essentially what our economy is based on is combustion. So we take a fossil-based fuel, we add oxygen, and we burn it. And that creates the CO2 emissions as well as water as the output. So to close that combustion loop, essentially what Joule does is reversing that combustion process, is to take the CO2 and water as the input, run it through this microcosm of a factory that's basically embodied by our organism. It's a biological organism. And out comes the direct fuel that you can pump directly into the fuel infrastructure. And the beauty of that is that at the grand scale, we would be addressing about 7 billion tons of CO2 emissions worldwide. And whether or not we could do that, we're not trying to say that we can't do all that, but we believe that we're one of the major solutions to the problem that we have on the planet. What this also means is a very efficient process that takes away a lot of the downstream processing necessary. So we create this above ground oil reserve, if you will, and in real time, in a one-step process, we could be producing fuels that could then be pumped into the gas pump and be used in the transportation system. So as Christoph already mentioned, our initial step is to use industrial sources of flue gas, meaning waste streams of gas streams coming out of stacks of emitters like power plants, cement plants, or other large industrial plants. So we would basically be channeling that flue gas into our system and then be producing fuels. The future of that technology pathway is to be able to hook up to an air capture system, and then we don't have to be co-located or very close to an emitter source. Rather, we could be in the middle of some of the best locations where there's a lot of sunlight to generate the best productivity rate possible, and supply the local or the global markets with the fuels necessary. We believe that air capture CO2 creates this opportunity for scaling, for being free of some of the siting constraints for our process. So that's why we're really happy to be in this conversation to talk about what our future could look like in relation to some of the efforts by the UN and as reported by the Deep Decarbonization Pathway Projects report last year and updated this year. That in order to keep to the 2-degree increase in global average temperature, we really have to make an effort towards negative emissions and really have actual technology solutions that are actionable around the world. And Joule, along with our partners, we're co-chairing this roundtable on low carbon transport fuels to bring to COP21 these potential solutions. And so it's really exciting that to really talk about how public and private sectors could group together, can link arms, partner together, and create an ecosystem where the business environment could be alive and well, and really marrying different parts of the technology along the value chain to make this a reality for the future.
Excellent, thank you, Cece. And we'll talk a lot more about some of the things that you touched upon. Frank.
So Cece has described effectively a means to effectively a carbon neutral fuel, which is a pretty beautiful thing if you could neutralize 25% of the emissions on the planet that comes from vehicles. And we would like to play a part in that as a carbon capturer and deliverer of carbon to Joule and Cece and her colleagues to make possible that outcome. I'm here for the same reason you're here. We read the paper. I suspect all of us were aware when Al Gore, as congressman, invited Jim Hansen to the Hill, and Hansen said, perhaps for the first time in a forum of that nature, climate change is real and we're causing it. And I'm just delighted to be at a place like National Grid, in the business that National Grid is in. We're right on the video screen. the statement is made that climate change is real. And just to clarify, I was in an overcoat and a hat and a scarf, and I was frozen. Klaus Lackner was in a sports jacket and was so energized by what he was saying, he was warm. And I finally said, Klaus, I'm about to expire here, and I think, you know, your mental capacity and action is so profoundly fast that it enables you to avoid hypothermia. But I was frozen, and Klaus was apparently imperturbable by the weather. As we sit here today, ice caps are melting. Occasionally, in the Siberian tundra, methane explodes from deep beneath the planet, and the seas are rising. On the front page of the New York Times yesterday, we read about a refugee disaster and the fact that we're coming up with 100,000 spots in this country, and it's not enough. Well, that refugee crisis will be vastly eclipsed by what we will see if we let this happen. And I met Klaus Lackner in actually December of '01 because he is the father of the notion of taking out of the air CO2 and hopefully doing something with it. Obviously, the core technical solution is to take it out of the air and put it someplace where it will remain forever. But those places are few and far between and not yet blessed by any government, with the exception perhaps of the Statoil sequestration that's going on in the North Sea. We are in the 8th year of a 10-year program financed by the United States government to find out where in subterranean sandstone formations beneath impermeable rock we can put CO2 in this country. The Canadians are engaged in the same thing. When that decision is shared with all of us, when the research is made public that we can put it in this desert and in this field, then will come the political argument that sounds something like, not in my Yucca Mountain. So we'll be some years before we can sequester, which is a good thing, because we can learn how to capture where we are, where that site is where we can sequester, and actually take right out of the air the CO2 and pump it from our direct air capture machine into the earth. Today, if we had a place to put it, we'd have to ship the CO2 there, which takes energy, whether we get it there by truck or by pipe. So we actually are a benefit corporation, so we can invest in the science at ASU and elsewhere, so we can capture more than 2% concentration. In other words, we're not going to spend the money to put 2% in the ground. We've got to have a less dilute source of air to sequester. So I'm here for the same reason you are here. You value energy, you value food, you value water. All of these things are interrelated, and the fact that we can use carbon in greenhouses enables us to grow a lot more food in very small spaces, and in fact, provide for one of our needs with a heck of a lot less water than we do in the fields that we grow in today. So this is what drives me and my colleague Javid Abraham, and we will actually be in the market in the first quarter of 2016 with units for indoor cultivators. And I'm excited to be with you and look forward to this dialogue.
Thank you, Frank. Peter.
Well, I don't want to show my age, but I started working in this thing in the 80s when we had the last energy crisis, and I was at that time working with the Exxon that at that time was motivated for all these things because they thought we were going to run out of oil. They weren't at that time motivated by, I don't know if you remember the gas lines in the 80s, but, and so at that time, they decided to be switched from becoming a oil company to becoming an energy company. I ran their renewable energy program. All the stuff you're reading about today, algae to fuels, CO2 to plastics, all those things were worked on, and they spent an enormous amount of money at that time trying to develop those technologies. And of course, at that point, what had happened, what's happening today, the Arabs decided to drop the price of oil to $10 a barrel, and they decided to go back and be an oil company. In any case, during those period of time, I formulated a vision of the future, namely one where we would take CO2 from the air, we'd use sunlight, take CO2 from the air, and then use that sunlight also to split water and combine it to make our fuels and to make all our, and a similar thing to make all our materials, our building materials. Composite plastics and everything like that. And so when the Arabs dropped the price of oil, I went to Princeton University, set up an institute there, and then finally in the 1990s I decided to go to Columbia and found the Earth Institute. And there I met my partner and co-founder of Global Thermostat, Professor Graciela Chilsoniski, who is the author of The Carbon Market, and she was looking at the global and social and political consequences of having a source of CO2 that could enable the developing countries to participate in the process of Kyoto. They don't have a lot of power plants, and so they can't participate very well in the notion of mitigating fossil fuel emissions, but they all have air, they all have sunlight, and so we sat down together and said, what does the world need? And we decided if you had a process that was driven by the sun, took the CO2 from the air, and combined it with the hydrogen produced by water or other ways, that you could end up with a system that mimics photosynthesis, where you could use that product either make your fuel, as has been described in a carbon neutral way, or make your body parts, in the analogy of it, our physical infrastructure, and sequester it and achieve a sustainable future. So we founded in about 2008 our company to do this, and it was also to some extent influenced by Klaus, because Klaus gave a talk in my lecture, and he was thinking about taking CO2 out of the air, and I had come with this notion of doing this with solar radiation, and ran up to him after his lecture and say, how about driving all this with solar radiation? And he sort of said to me, Peter, you're nuts. We have one technology that doesn't work. How are we going to make two technologies that don't work, right? Right. But in any case, that didn't stop me, because people like us are crazy, and we don't get stopped by people who are saying you can't do it. In any case, we recognized, getting back to the point about the ecosystem, if you had in place this carbon capture and ability for humans to close the carbon cycle, you would solve three problems that plague our planet. The climate change is a clear one, but you'd also have a distributed source of energy. All the wars, all the conflicts we fight because energy sources are so maldistribution would disappear, because energy could be produced locally and not in centralized places and have to transport. And then finally, contrary to most thoughts, and my partner is a world-leading economist, if we made the transition to this new ecosystem, it's not going to cost the economy something. It's going to be the spur for economic growth, global economic growth. There'll be new jobs created, new industries created. The classic way that you lift yourself out of a economic demise is to come up with a new thing that everybody invests in and does the work to make successful. So we proceeded to do this. We got funding, and we now have got to the point where our technology has been vetted by Linde, NRG, SABIC, Reliance, all these major corporations, and they all have concurred that we have the capability to remove CO2 from the atmosphere for under $50 a ton. So where I sit here today is having this feeling that we have, in fact, all the people on this stage, we have a roadmap, as it's a feasible roadmap to travel, yet air capture is getting about zero public dollars. And we're putting $20 billion or something more per year or something, or in total, into trying to reduce the emissions from flue gas, which won't solve the problem. And I'd just like to end by saying, why are we sitting with this false paradigm? We're sitting with this false paradigm because of the acid rain problem. You may have heard there was sulfur being emitted from coal plants, and they thought that that was causing the lakes and the forests in the east to become acidified, just like the ocean is now being acidified by CO2. And so they decided to pass regulations to limit sulfur emissions in coal plants, and it worked. And they thought, okay, why not apply the same approach to the removal of carbon from the atmosphere? But there was one little problem. When you put sulfur into the atmosphere, it goes on the ground, and within 10 years, it gets immobilized and made inert due to becoming a mineral. And so if you think of a bathtub, think of putting SO2 or CO2 into the bathtub, and think about the mineralization of it as a drain that takes it out. So as long as you have less CO2 going into the bathtub and it's being taken out by the natural processes, you'll be okay. The flaw is they thought the same thing would happen for CO2, but they now just realized that 50% of the CO2 doesn't come out of the atmosphere, the increased concentration, for 500 to 1,000 years. There is no drain. So that's why it's just continuing to build up. And so you can't solve it, as was pointed out here, by reducing the amount of CO2 that you put, that goes into the atmosphere. You actually have to create a drain to take it out. And there is no more natural drain. There is really no other solution. It may be it's a necessary, and I believe also sufficient, but certainly necessary condition to have a technology that creates a drain in the carbon cycle for the human contributions to it. And I come back to the fact that we are in this situation where we know it can be done, and we know that we have all these other people that have ways of translating that into valuable products, either in energy or in materials that would sequester it, and yet there's no public recognition of this, no dollar spent to support that. And I think that one of the reasons for events like this is to make people understand that we're not talking about a fantasy, we're talking about something that can be done, and there has to be a way to reframe the problem away from this mitigation of emissions, avoided carbon, to a policy that has negative carbon.
Thanks, Peter. This is a perfect segue into the question on the metric that everyone seems to care about, which is dollars. And frankly, dollars per ton of carbon dioxide is what we're talking about. And in 2011, there was a report put out by the American Physical Society that was a direct attack, to use a sort of aggressive phrase, on this industry that said direct air capture may be relevant and could be something that's useful for addressing climate change, but the first of a kind can't be done for possibly less than $600 a ton. And we have Peter here who could say that a third party that deals with carbon dioxide, which is Linde, and for those who aren't familiar with them, they do a lot with carbon dioxide in a number of forms, from compressing it to capturing it from flue gas. They have said that his dollars, they've put a dollar amount on that. For Frank, he's not talking about a science experiment. He's talking about building prototypes in Q1 of 2016. And for Cece, we have a site and a technology pathway that shows a development in Hobbs, New Mexico, where this technology is getting put to work. So my question to you, as we speak about an industry that is undercapitalized and those who want to put money to work and in a way are sitting on the sidelines and say, hey, this is a great idea, I want to invest in it. And as you now show me that the dog will eat the dog food and it really does cost a certain amount, what next? What's it going to take?
Well, if I could jump in, I think Peter makes a great point, and that is that we're pursuing a losing strategy. If we simply take 99.9% off the top of our flue stacks and get content, well then we are on the trajectory that has got all of us here today, which is rising seas and failed ice caps. I see where we are right now effectively as being akin to where we were in '81 with photovoltaics. And that's an interesting story because it brings up the public funds issue that Peter has raised. Because from 55 to 81, the United States government effectively created an industry in chrysalis. We had wanted to put in space satellites. We didn't know how to energize those satellites because it's cold up there, and batteries don't last too long in the cold. So we knew we had to capture energy from the sun. And so the United States government put money at Bell Labs and at a few other places and said, capture energy from the sun and we will power our satellites with that energy. And by God, they found a way to spray carbon on silicon, or boron on silicon, and I'm sorry, I'm carbon mode here, but they sprayed boron on silicon and did in fact capture 6% of what was being emitted by the sun. Think about that. So suddenly, in a year, less than a year, in the year 1955, we did that. In 1981, Westinghouse had created a prototype production line. Not a prototype panel, they had that. Now they had the line to produce, and Mr. Stockman at OMB cut funding by 80%. Well, where are we today? We are surrounded in this room probably by 600 ppm CO2, which as Christophe pointed out, is one of the most valuable commodities on the planet. We can use it, and do use it for everything. We're going to capture it out of the atmosphere, and we're going to make fuel with it. Why would we do that? Well, one, it neutralizes what we're putting back into the atmosphere because we took it out of the atmosphere in the first place. It is that carbon that we're returning. The other reason we're going to do it is because in the next 35 years, we're going to have 9.2 billion people on this planet, and we're going to have to burn in 27 years, 80% of all the fuel we've burned to date in the next 27 years. So again, I'm sure Klaus is listening in ASU, to use one of his lines, we're going to be using more stones than they did in the Stone Age. And that's the truth. So what CC is doing at Joule, what Peter is doing, is so absolutely essential to civility, because without energy, we cease to be a civilization.
I would like to pick up on what Frank's point made about how the seed for the solar thing was in space and in some sense in national security. And what I find amazing is it's not widely known, but the Defense Department issues a list of threats to the president each year. And they have definitely listed that climate change is a major threat to global security and to U.S. security. And by the way, we talked about the immigration issue. There was an op-ed by Friedman that pointed out that he thought the social chaos was actually stimulated by the lack of water, the lack of extreme heat, and that caused the people to recognize that their governments couldn't provide for their basic needs. So the situation is, even now, we could suggest that just for the purpose of national security, to be able to mitigate this climate problem would be a basis for public investment, right? But you all know the problem, right? Once a national system has a metaphor, right, and DOE has a billion-dollar program to do research to clean up fossil fuel plants, and Senator Byrd passes a law in Congress that says you can only do research on cleaning up coal, right? Did you know that he passed a rider on DOE that says you cannot spend any R&D money on anything other than cleaning up coal, right? With the system entrenched that way, that's what we're fighting. At any paradigm change, we're trying to find a way to demonstrate. And what we have done, and I think all the people on the stage have done, is said, okay, we can't wait for the federal government to wake up. We can't, unfortunately, wait for this recognition of how we have the solution that can actually solve this problem. But we have to first go out and demonstrate it and make money doing it. We have to find a way to survive within the normal commerce market. And how do we do that? Instead of worrying about sequestering the CO2, we're going to do carbon capture use, and in some cases storage at the same time. And as was listed in the introduction, it turns out when we made this switch from thinking about solving the climate problem to making a profitable company, it turns out carbon is a very valuable product, right? And at prices at $50, even $100 a ton, right? You can make a lot of money by selling carbon to be incorporated into products. One of the reasons you make so much money, and I'll use that as an example, then I'll stop, is because of what's mentioned here before, because you can produce the product where it's used. So take the industrial gas business. When you drink a bottle of Coca-Cola, you're emitting CO2. It's a small example of it. Coca-Cola spends $250 a ton in getting that CO2 from a company like Linde or Air Products. Out of that $250, $125 is transportation costs of taking it from the Midwest, compressing it, putting it in shipping cars, and getting it to the supplier. So air capture starts with a $150 edge, right? And certainly if I'm telling you $50, let's say I'm wrong, let's say it's $100. We can certainly sell at a profit at $250. Let me give you one final application that just came up recently, which is also relevant to the same idea, industrial gas. I don't know if you know, but when you do the desalination of water, you cannot drink the water the way it is, because it's free of all minerals, and if you drink distilled water, your bones will dissolve. And so what they have to do is remineralize the CO2, the desalinated water, and you do that by bubbling CO2 in it and with calcium and remineralizing it. And we are doing a demonstration project in Israel to take their desalination plant and provide the CO2 to create water that's drinkable. And if you think about the future, there's going to be more and more desalination projects, and this is going to be a potentially big market for the use of CO2.
Thanks. Cece, do you want to?
Yeah, so I wanted to kind of pick up on one of the points that Peter made, in that our government certainly has not been an advocate of technologies like air capture, or in fact to what Joule is doing. For the last couple decades, the US government has funded the development of cellulosic ethanol. And to this date, there's only a couple of plants that are online, and we're still very far from the original RFS, the Renewable Fuel Standard, targets for cellulosic volumes. And on the flip side, Joule as a company, we've been around since 2007, so 8 years. And we've been funded entirely by the private sector, $200 million of money, all coming from the private sector, not a single grant dollar received from the U.S. government. And it's a real uphill battle in this arena, because of this sort of sense that this technology doesn't fit into the paradigm that they're used to. So what do I mean by that? So typically, as I mentioned already, you have the first generation food-based ethanol, so corn, sugar cane, and such. And then that led to the second generation cellulosic ethanol, which takes biomass, so woody biomass, or other types of plant material to convert to liquid fuels. And the third generation is kind of what people are calling advanced biofuels, and that's algal biomass turned into fuels. Sometimes it's algal bio-oil, oil that's made by algae, then collected and made esterified into a fuel blend. So what Joule has proposed to do is to not do any of that. Essentially, we create a catalyst. We use the biomass, the organism itself, as a catalyst. So we don't want to have to. A good analogy is if you are thinking about raising cows, and you want to get milk. So the typical type of method is essentially to slaughter the cow to access the milk. So that's what algae biomass or biofuels does, right? So you collect the biomass, you grow a lot of the algae, and then you pull it apart to get access to either the oil inside or turn the biomass into something else. So what we actually do is we are raising the cows to actually just milk it. And so this technology just doesn't really fit into the U.S. government's normal notion. And so we have certainly seen this not such a favorable climate for outside of the box types of technologies like what is being discussed here. So that's kind of a problem, I think, to kind of essentially there's this way in which the government has decided to pick certain technologies to support, and that hasn't been very supportive of other innovations. But coming back to what could we do in this undercapitalized environment, and as Peter already mentioned, we have to basically show that each of our technology can stand alone in an economic way, and so that when we combine them together, we can bring us a valuable solution that creates value at the end of the day. And it's a hard thing to do, but it's being creative, thinking again outside of the box, and thinking of different types of partnerships to combine into this ecosystem approach, and so that we can actually show the world it is feasible, it is possible, and it is actually, we have line of sight to near-term commercialization of such technologies. So.
Great, thanks.
One additional comment I might make is that there is this tension that we experience that is an important effect. If you switch from the model of this is for national security, it should be of the public interest, there should be incentives to do it, to the fact that you have to make money doing it in real time, you're driven to do things like CC has to do. You start with doing fossil fuel plants, even though that doesn't solve the problem, right? You don't go direct because it's more difficult to trying to demonstrate that you can start with air capture and do the whole thing through. And we're all driven in our way. In our company, our technology actually can be used both to clean up carbon from the air and clean up carbon from flue gas. And we're finding it easier to get customers who would like to clean up carbon from the flue gas because that fits the paradigm, right? It fits the financing paradigm, it fits the DOE paradigm, and so we're driven, and this is always a tension in our company, between should we, in order to be economically sustainable, we should go that low-cost path. We'll demonstrate a lot about our technology if doing it, but we won't put aside the skepticism that air capture itself can be done at low cost, but we'll show that in our case that the technology is so similar that's plausible. So we are, as we were all describing here, fighting uphill at some level. On the other hand, you know, if you look back at the history of innovation, I'm not sure that those that get the blessing of the government are the ones that win in the end. Matter of fact, one of the reasons in our company I discouraged us from getting government funding or even putting any effort to do it was my experience at Exxon in the last energy crisis. We got all ginned up, we're going to do it, you know, and the corporation made many big investments based on the DOE policy. The price of the oil went down and, you know, the politicians changed their point of view and we were left holding the bag, having put a lot of effort to go in a direction that couldn't be sustained politically, and it was the political motivation that made it economically viable. So I have some degree of comfort that all of us here, by getting the discipline of the marketplace to begin with, is really going to, in the end, be useful to all of us. However, it does force us to take these detours of doing projects that fit as much as possible into the existing paradigm, rather than pursuing the answer we know will work. That's the really frustrating thing. We know there's a path. We know if we get on the learning curve, as was implicit in Frank's statement, if you start solar and then you start more and more and you learn by doing, and you know the price of solar from those days has come out by 1,000 or something from what it was on the first satellites. We know that we can go down this learning curve and get what may be $50 a ton per day to $25 a ton in the future. And that's a number I think that Klaus has thrown around in the past, and I don't see any reason not true. So the longer we delay, the longer it takes us to get on the learning curve, the longer it takes us to get ready when the world is going to come and say, hey, we need this, right? Right? They're going to recognize it, whether they recognize it today or 5 years, it's inevitable, right? And so we're all trying to get ready as best we can, and it's certainly good. That's why I participate in events like this, if we can start to make the understanding that the existing paradigm is wrong and a new paradigm is required, and to make it, just show you how difficult it is. The IPCC report in 2013 said there is no solution without negative carbon. Yet the draft in COP21 doesn't mention negative carbon. The draft agreement, because they're also locked into the past of how their countries are going to do it by reducing carbon emissions, and you know, this is a very large inertial system. You don't churn this tanker in any quick time. So there is a real significant challenge we all face. But for me, there is no reason not to, in any way, to get discouraged, because we all can see that the path exists, that we can travel it, we can do it in an economically viable way. It's not a matter of if, it's just a matter of when.
Can I just make a quick comment?
Yep.
This is not exactly a mainstream concept at National Grid. I can also say this is not a mainstream concept that any of the utilities. I've spoken to my counterparts at other utilities, and they're not thinking about this, and they've always said exactly, why are you doing this, how are you making money? So everything I'm talking about has an implicit assumption that there is a price for carbon. But the reason I'm interested in this is that I think it's inevitable. It will happen at some point. I don't know when, it could be 2 years or 20 years, but it will happen. But without that, I can't see, quite frankly, how utilities get involved to get to the scale of the reductions that we need. But what's great, I'm providing the utilities perspective, but what's really great is, you have 3 representatives here who are not waiting for that, who have found a way to capture the CO2 today and essentially have a commodity that can monetize. But I want to throw that out there. Everything I'm talking about from a utilities perspective has an implicit assumption that there is a price for CO2 in the future. And it doesn't matter, quite frankly, I'm agnostic whether it's a tax on carbon or it's a cap and trade.
Well, we have a price for carbon in the markets that we're going to pursue next year. The hobbyists that buy carbon by the small canister and release it in their grow tents to grow tomatoes and lettuce and God knows what else. I'm sorry, was that? I guess the point I was trying to make is that at the end of the day, they pay $1,000, $2,000 a ton by the time they buy canister after canister after canister. So yeah, it would be very convenient if the government put a price on carbon as they thought about doing with the carbon market in 2011, but didn't do. So we're not going to pursue that because that's a difficult fight to win. But we can actually sell for a lot less to that hobbyist who needs to buy carbon to grow those tomatoes. What really has been troubling about the governmental response in this is that they've not stepped in to create a market for our capability without mentioning one exception right off the bat. They haven't, for example, done what they've done in solar with incentives. But California has stepped in and has said, we need the kind of fuel that Juul's going to make. And that's a great thing for Juul, and eventually it will be a great thing for Infinity and Juul when we're providing the carbon for Juul's fuel. We look to the government to create markets, but they do get stuck. The Republicans in the OMB that stopped funding solar in '81 thought we were stuck in solar. But it's instructive to take a look at what the Japanese did with the industry that they took when they took all those researchers and put them to work in Tokyo and elsewhere. They immediately went to market with a mass market product, which were Casio calculators with a little strip of solar on there, or those wristwatches that we all walked around with in 1980 that were almost the size of your wrist. That was a quick way to market. That's what we're doing at Infinity. We're going to go to market quickly, and we're going to sell to hobbyists for a very small fraction of the price they pay for carbon today. But the government does get stuck in ruts. Look at algae. We started to invest in this country at the same time the Japanese and the Germans started to invest in algae in 1941. We sensed we needed energy in 1941, and we sure did. That's how we won the war. But we've been throwing money at algae since 1941 to try and make fuel energy efficiently, and we haven't succeeded. Algae, as you know, grows in the water and is largely of water. So the carbon necessary to dewater and to dry algae makes it almost by definition energy negative. So you've put a lot of energy into getting a unit out, and it's not productive. And meanwhile, you've also got the problem with pond collapse or contagion of the algae pond. But it's hard to switch gears when you've made a commitment. We've made a huge commitment in this country to ethanol. 26 states with more than 200 ethanol plants online today, 885 gallons of water for every gallon of ethanol. That's nuts. But once we get on a path in this country, we're persistent, even if we know we're wrong. So what we've decided to do in our companies, all 3 of our companies, is to drive home in small markets and try and make some dollars now to grow into the bigger challenges it faces.
Thanks, Frank. I want to pick up on a couple things that you've touched on, but I think it's instructive for the audience to, as we think about carbon as a commodity, and we can get it from the air or we can get it from flue gas. And Peter's company thinks about getting it from both, and it a lot of times makes sense to get it from both. And carbon capture and storage from flue gas is something that we will need to implement, but we're not talking about implementing it on this panel specifically. But Don, I know that National Grid is very involved with a carbon capture and storage facility on the other side of the Great Atlantic Puddle, and there's a comment that Klaus makes that I'd like to pick up on, which is that if we know that we can pull carbon dioxide out of the air and get rid of it, and put a price on that, that will motivate conventional flue gas capture. And the reason he says that is because capturing carbon dioxide from anywhere is acknowledging that there's this great market externality, which is too much CO2 in the air, and we need to figure out how to price it. And power plants that are emitting it are going to have to pay a price for it. So I want to start with you and then also leave it to the other panelists. But if we can provide negative emissions with air capture, how does that change the name of the game for utilities and then also carbon capture and storage in general?
Yeah, I mean, if there's a price on it, it would be a game changer because utilities would have to go carbon neutral. And then the way I see it is, then you can think about utilities as providing the service of negative carbon emissions. The way, and what's really great about this technology, you were talking about flue gas, right? In the traditional model that we're doing in UK, what do? There's a coal plant, right? There's a smokestack CO2 coming up there, coming out of it. They capture the CO2, they put in the pipe, and they take it somewhere and they inject it under the ground. If this technology, gets to the point of where we think we will in the future is, let's say Brooklyn Union, this utility of National Grid that serves our customers in Brooklyn and Staten Island, decides to implement this technology and there is a price for it, right? So say in 1 year, we put out X amount of CO2 as a result of using natural gas. So all of our customers in Brooklyn and Staten Island use the commodity and they put out X. We can pull out that X that makes it carbon neutral, but we can do it in Australia. So that takes away this whole issue with the power plants where you're actually capturing the CO2 from where it's being generated. Here we're saying it doesn't matter, right? If a customer is putting out a CO2 in Brooklyn, I can take out that same amount in Australia. And the reason I'm doing Australia is I don't have to build the infrastructure because there might be a commercial need. Maybe Joule has some sort of a company there. They're producing liquid fuels. Or maybe what you guys have been talking about is over time, to get to the scales, this 500 gigaton problem, you have to figure out a way, and you can do it today, the technology works, but it's to doing it at a lower price to mineralize it. So because there's been a lot of issues, do you take the CO2, do you inject it back as gas? You could do it as liquid, but it takes a lot of water. But there is a way of taking this and turning it into a mineral and sequestering it that way naturally, and you could do that for a very long time. So all those models begin to develop if you have that price on CO2.
Yeah, let me point out another consequence of having the wrong framework. Today, when you do a life cycle analysis, according to DOE, they don't care where the CO2 came from, they just care where it ended up. So you have this absurd situation that today, if you take CO2 from a dome where it's already sequestered in California or Nevada, pipeline it 500 miles to Texas, stick it underground, and push oil out that's going to then emit CO2, you can get a carbon credit for taking CO2 that was previously stored and just putting it back in the same situation where it started. And that's because the system, in not recognizing negative carbon as the appropriate life cycle analysis metric, but having been settled because it fits their need of using avoided carbon as the accepted metric, is in fact encouraging behavior that is not going to get to the solution. So I've been working with somebody at Georgia Tech that is in the middle of this whole life cycle analysis community. There's a community that DO goes to of experts. They give out grants to do assessments of looking at various process technologies and are trying to get as one step, get them, the life cycle analysis people themselves, to understand the difference between negative carbon and avoided carbon.
I guess, so Peter, you meant an earthen dome. So the carbon is already sequestered
Right.
and has been there for millions of years.
Right.
So they're taking what is sequestered carbon, resequestering probably not all of it,
Right.
and getting a carbon credit for it, in spite of the fact that it's liberating carbon for us to put in the atmosphere.
Exactly.
That's how it works today.
Exactly.
That's perversity.
So, Cece, I don't know if you want to comment on the CCS versus air capture, because today Joule is looking at getting its feedstock of carbon dioxide to create this bioenergy from flue gas, and tomorrow you hope to get it from air, and that, as you said, significantly opens up your process because, one, you can go where it's sunniest and the algae will photosynthesize, and two, now you don't need a long pipeline that takes your source and gets it to your algae.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I would have a hard time talking about what that might, I mean, how to compare that with CCS, because those things are quite different. But I think the goal of getting to, for Joule, it's about, at this time, about getting to carbon neutral mobility. So getting our transportation sector as close to carbon neutral as possible. And based on our own LCA assessment, and we worked with others on this, we could approach about 91% CO2 emissions reduction compared with gasoline. So that's pretty significant. And I don't think there's any other player out there in the similar space that can claim anything close to that in reality. But I mean, when you think about CCS, it's about being negative, right? So negative net emissions of CO2 is what we're talking about. So perhaps with a different way to think about LCA, I don't know what it is, we could think about how that air capture CO2 might impact such an equation. But I think, to Peter's point, that whole area isn't very well developed, and we're just trying to follow suit with whatever the mechanism or the methodology really is out there for life cycle analysis to kind of recognize, what is our energy balance? Are we doing better than, are we putting out more megajoules of fuel than we're actually putting in? Are we hopefully really getting to as little CO2 emissions on a life cycle basis as possible? So I think, ultimately there's this whole notion of CCU, carbon capture and utilization, alongside CCS, create the potential future solution for for the world to get closer and closer to carbon neutral and maybe negative carbon. But only thinking about CCS, I think, won't quite get us there, because we just have so much demand for energy, and there's limited ways to store carbon, as we already discussed. So,
if I can point out another irony of the situation, we, as I said, have a technology that both can take it from flue gas and from the air. We went to a major power producer, utility, and had them compare with a third party the cost of having to retrofit onto a coal plant, remove the CO2 with all the impurities and all the higher temperature that flue gas comes from, and then use it for some process, compared to doing, as was pointed out, air capture in someplace else where you'd be right on top of where you could sell the product. It turns out that it's cheaper. That's the irony of the thing. Not only, it looks seductive. The first step, it's higher concentration, it's easy to do. But if you go from start to finish, the numbers turn out that if you can locate your facility and do this offsetting, right? And I'll say one more thing about offsetting. If you could do this offsetting, you could offer utilities a cheaper way, even with starting with the process that the air capture first step is 2 or 3 times more expensive, literally, than the CO2 from the flue gas. But by the time you finish all the economics, the increased revenue you get, the reduction in the amount of transportation costs you need to do, you actually make more money doing air capture. That's how perverse it. Now, let's talk about offsetting. So we actually, the only time we've got in touch with the government was when the EPA was writing these recent regulations. We tried to get them to include offsetting as a part of the rules, because it would give power companies like yours the flexibility, like to find the lowest cost solution, which is, that's basically the American way, right? But the EPA was so worried that anything that made that regulation complicated, that the coal companies, your type of companies or utilities would come in, not you particularly, but other utilities, right, would come in and make an issue of thing in court about that having offsetting would create some states' rights versus blah, 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 and so they didn't want to touch it, right? So we are sitting here in a time, because of the efforts of the people here and many other people, where, as I said, we really have, if we could have it, an impartial panel of experts that are not a thing. We do have a roadmap. We understand what we're doing is roughly insane, right, in the way we're expending our resources. And yet we're all struggling to do the steps we can and the processes we do step by step to try to alter that. But to me, it's very encouraging to be able to see all these innovations, and there's only a few here. I mean, the innovation that's going out in the use of CO2 is just mind-boggling. The number of small companies that are using it. They make graphene out of CO2 now from the air rather than from graphite. There are companies that find a way not to do fast growth in greenhouses, but do it out in the open, which would revolutionize agriculture enormously, right, if you could find a way to do that again. So, and there's a whole group in Europe with BASF and the major chemical companies that are finding new catalysts to replace, so you can start with CO2 as your initial feedstock rather than having to start with petroleum. So all this innovation is going on, and so that's the good side of the story. And so I'm encouraged that we're in, as a member of this human race, that our knowledge has gotten to the point that we know there's a path to solution, right? We don't have to do something miraculous, invent some new magic element or anything like that to solve this problem. Through the innovations of all of these people here and many others, and certainly Klaus and his colleagues earlier on, we're in this position where we can see the future. And I tell that to my class, who come in depressed, usually, because they sense all this counter forces that make us feel we're never going to address this problem. But I'd say it's still a better situation to have those counter forces and know, in a third-party due diligence, independent way, that there is a path to the future. And I want you to all feel the same way, but I'd like you to get angry at all the rest of the stuff.
Step by step is the right comment. We understand some chemistry, and so do you. You took it in 10th grade. And when you took it, you understood that some types of chemicals want other types of chemicals, and they bind with them, hard or soft. And what we're doing is we have a resin that wants CO2. And we have that resin on a screen through which CO2 passes thanks to the wind. And it binds to the resin. But it binds ever so elegantly, such that when placed into a greenhouse, the resin releases. And then the plants in that greenhouse consume it. So what we've done is render neutral what was a CO2 polluting enterprise. You've potentially been to the Netherlands, and you've flown in and you've seen the landscape of greenhouses. And there are many other landscapes like that, and they buy CO2 by the ton, delivered in big trucks that may have the name Praxair on them or some other big industry, and they buy by the ton CO2 to make those plants grow fast, to increase the product that they can sell, increase the yield. We want to make some portion of that industry carbon neutral as opposed to carbon polluting. And we can do that. So step by step is the message that Peter gives us today. And that's a message that we've embraced, because with our carbon capture capability, we can do that today. We can provide it to small hobbyists. We can provide it to urban cultivators, which is another way to cut carbon footprint considerably. You can grow your lettuce here instead of having it shipped from the Central Valley of California. So your farm to fork on the salad you'll have tonight is not 2,000 miles, but rather a couple of blocks. That's not a bad thing.
Thanks. I'd like to open the last part of this panel up to questions to the audience. And for those who are still bearing with us online, please tweet questions to @ASU_CNCE, and I'll be able to read those off. And audience, if you feel shy, you're also welcome to tweet as well. But we have Heather going around with the microphone, so first come, first serve hands. And if there are no questions, I'm happy to keep going. Complete comprehension. Well done.
Oh, wait, there's a question.
There we go.
Somebody will start it.
Hi, Dan Miller from the Road Group. We invest in these kinds of things. So it's very exciting about what can be done, but there's a problem in that most companies can emit CO2 for free. And it's hard to compete with that. There was a little bit of discussion, but not much about policies that we could put in place that would make what we're talking about today, capturing carbon, not only useful in sort of very specific ways for specific products that can be used in relatively small amounts relative to the size of the problem, but could really be done on a very, very large scale. Can the folks on the panel comment on what they think might be the best policies to put in place to make that happen?
I think you mentioned it. Right?
Yeah, you've heard a lot of people talk about it, but you're right. Here you have companies who have figured out a way to monetize their CO2, but they are very niche products. But to solve the problem that we were talking about, 500 gigaton, there has to be a policy, and it has to be a price on carbon. I think the most efficient way to do it is tax. A lot of economists, this is not an original idea, people have been talking about that. You need to tax it, because you're right, you can emit CO2 today, and that cost is socialized by everyone. So we all need to pay for it. Or another way is to do it through cap and trade. But for it to work from a policy perspective, there does need to be a price that society pays for this.
It's basically to put an economic value on an externality that society bears. And I think, in the absence of policy, it really makes it very difficult for companies like ours to get started, as we already mentioned. And so we look for ways to do other things in the meantime to get there. But if there were policy attention in this area, it could accelerate technology innovation and adoption of technologies by incumbents in a much faster way. And that would be very positive for society.
Let me just make one comment. I'm one of the avid watcher of C-SPAN and the Congress and the committees. And they all, at least the people that are not climate deniers, come out and say, look, we recognize there's a problem. We'd like to do this, but right now people are telling us it's going to cost $50 to $100 a ton to collect it from flue gas. The utilities tell us it's going to make the price of electricity go up, right? If somebody came in and told us there was a way, we don't want to pass legislation that forces people to do things that there's no solution for. Right? You can't do that, because that would cause economic dislocation and nobody will buy that. So I believe there's a catch-22 situation, which we're all fighting, right? That is, the minute we can demonstrate that the price is acceptable, that you can remove CO2 from both flue gas and from the air at costs under $50 a ton in a reliable way, right? You will see legislation come, because then that price, it's the same thing, by the way, it's the same thing that happened, remember I mentioned the acid gas problem, the acid sulfur thing? When that legislation was being considered, all the power plants said, oh, it's going to raise the price of electricity. They gave how much it would cost per ton. They passed the legislation, the price was 1/4 to 1/5 what they all claimed it would be. The same thing will happen here, right? That's right. And so the IPCC writing in public for the first time that there is no solution without negative carbon is a major watershed event, right? The thing is beginning to tilt, right? And the good thing about it is, through the efforts of people here and many other people, when it tilts, there's a lot of information to enable it to go the whole way, right? So it's just a matter of somehow reaching a critical mass. Maybe we'll take some more horrible droughts. Maybe we'll take some event as you know, the way these political systems think, to pass a carbon tax, to say we can no longer wait any longer. And as you've heard here, in the meantime, all of us are sort of taking advantage of the time to try to get our technologies further developed, get our costs down, demonstrating that they all work through these sort of projects that Frank and we are going to do, and others are going to, and CC are doing, to show that it's real. It's not that capturing CO2 from the air is a viable technology. So I think if we get to that point, the politicians will be much more willing to pass a carbon tax or a carbon market, and that's, I think, where we're going. Now, you mentioned California. We're in discussions with Southern California Utility because they have a constraint. They've got to do something because California passed a law. So they may be a good partner in which to try and demonstrate that this can be done. And we're in discussion with them because of that.
A good partner and a good example, because the president has utilized executive power to effectively bypass the Hill. And he's done that, and various of those on the Hill have said that this can't be done, this is unconstitutional, and he's wrong. Climate change is a fallacy. And the leader of the Senate has said so. So the likelihood of pressing through that body or those bodies a law that would be strong policy seems hard to imagine today. But if you look at what California's done, they've pursued an iterative approach on multiple levels, whether it's housing creation, building creation. They have new specifications about what emissions, what insulation, what energy provision has to be for all manner of different ways that are the ways Californians live, where they live, where they work, what they drive, and that will make markets for Jewel, for us, and others, for Peter. That seems a better model. Instead of coming down with sort of a monolith law that folks worry will change our competitiveness on the planet. And you know, there's a reason for fear when you look at a $30 billion gas purchase from Siberian fields that have not yet been tapped by the Chinese. People get worried about that. When you look at annexation of the Crimea, which is also gas rich, people get worried about that. They say, well, others are pursuing a hydrocarbon economy without concern about the atmosphere, and that will make them more powerful, and we will be less powerful. So there's so many different elements here at work when it comes to making decisions in DC that makes all of us afraid when we think about security. But ultimately, if there isn't energy, if there isn't enough water, if it's 120 degrees in Pakistan, we need to worry about that. So I really like what's happened in California because they've approached it on so many different levels. And maybe there'll be a way for us to communicate after this with a website or something and highlight what, in fact, laws they've put in place related to construction, related to automobiles, related to effluent.
Yeah, I think California has been known in this country and beyond that to kind of take the leadership role, and they'd like to have that role in leading climate-related policies. And I think one thing that they've done really well is looking at more science-based metrics for comparing technologies, whereas California is, you know, on the fuel and other technologies front, they look at life cycle analysis, despite the criticisms that we've mentioned, that, you know, at least it is somewhat of a comparable metric that is being utilized to compare very different pathways to the same problem. Whereas at the federal level, there is a little bit more of a politics-driven policy making, and that is kind of disconnected from the science, and that's where you start to have a lot of this dissonance from one sector to another. But you know, public policy is so important in you know, new technologies like sectors like ours. As I mentioned, you know, we've had investors put in $200 million. That doesn't come cheaply, And private investors, as I'm sure a lot of you know, in the venture capital field, there's a life cycle of about 7 years for any given startup. And we've been around for 8 years. And so, so, you know, patience eventually could run out. And to get from where we are, you know, we have, as Christoph already mentioned, we have a demonstration plant in Hobbs, New Mexico that we've been running for about 3 years now. So we do pilot testing, a lot of new R&D, as well as demonstration scale deployment there. But from here until actual commercial plant rollout, we're still a few years away. So there's got to be some bridging effect, and that needs to come from public and private sector partnership. And so in the absence of such policy attention, it becomes really hard for, no matter how creative we get, we can end up in the valley of death and never get out. So it's not just Joule, it's for technology companies like ours all around the world that face this kind of problem. And so you could have really creative ideas, really feasible technologies that don't ever really get to market. And that's kind of a sad story or potential outcome that you know, everybody should be aware of and call on our policymakers to try to make changes. So.
And you know, quick final comment on the pricing bill. This will happen regionally, not internationally. And there's been discussions about this. It's happening in California, and it might happen regionally at a national level, but not international. IPCC talked about this years ago. Can we float the concept of having a price that we all can agree to, the countries? And it was a non-starter. You know, countries like China would say, there's 500 gigaton problems. Why would I want a price without carbon if we didn't emit this carbon? It was essentially Americans and the Europeans who put out this CO2, you know, over the last few decades. What's interesting, what's great, you know, this may have gone by, but I want to emphasize the difference between air capture and capturing out of a stack. It solves the problem of where, how, and when it happened. Because if you go negative carbon, you're not only capturing what's coming out of your power plant today, you have to capture what was put out decades ago.
Actually, can I respond?
I'd like you to respond, but I want to make a response as well. Because I come from a policy background and think, how do we incentivize? How do we pay Frank not only for feeding carbon dioxide to make flowers in Holland, but the social value of feeding that carbon dioxide to make flowers in Holland? And how does Frank get rewarded where Praxair doesn't? And I don't think that requires a federal legislation. I don't even think it necessarily requires a state government, but it requires a government, and that could be a city. That could be a leading city that says, this is part of our carbon neutral balance. And we're going to pay Frank now for this because we think this is a technology that if it works, it's a big deal. It's transformative. So I think that as we get really good at accounting and knowing how much carbon dioxide we're pulling out of the air as we feed it to any commercial feedstock and figuring out how to incentivize that will really drive this forward. So I'll let you follow up.
But getting back to the question about how you get the rest of the world. So there is a policy called fee and dividend, which is the carbon tax. But you take 100% of the money collected and give it back to every citizen on an equal basis. That means people use less, make money on the deal. Most people would make money on that deal. But then you have the problem of America being less competitive and other countries. And so there's a second part to that where you put a border duty on products coming from countries without their own fee on carbon. And they're going to have to either decide to send a lot of money to the United States or keep it themselves. They'll decide to keep it themselves, especially if you do this with China and the EU. A couple of years later, every country will have a carbon fee because they won't want to send money to other countries. So there are ways of doing it that could incentivize people.
Right.
Get serious.
And the concept, I guess, you guys have been thinking about is, are you going towards, were you talking about like a certificate is issued? So if you produce carbon, and then if I am actually able to take that carbon, I take that certificate from you and I can monetize it somewhere, right? And it doesn't matter where it is as long as there's a market for it?
So Klaus wrote a paper in 1999 that had Kyoto gone another way, maybe people would have paid attention and used this scheme, but it basically was the concept of creating certificates of sequestration that would be sold in a world that wants to get to carbon neutral as quickly as possible. And the reason that that's a big deal and something that's valuable to have is historically the United States has emitted a lot of carbon. And I would be doubtful that in 2050, our future generations will look back at us in 2015 and say, no, they didn't get climate change. They didn't know it was a problem. We know it's a problem. We know that carbon dioxide accumulates in the atmosphere. And even though we can't pull it back today and get rid of it, we'll have to, which makes us liable. And that's a whole other panel if we want to get into the legal regulatory framework that's going to drive that. But by and large, I think that the incentive has to rely on, and just for people who aren't big in acronyms, LCA's life cycle assessment or analysis. And that will tell you what's the carbon footprint of this technology as we transition from there's a real value to pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere because we've valorized it. So are there more questions? Let's see one in the back.
Back.
Back left.
Yeah, please.
You addressed it earlier. I missed the early part of the session.
Sir, the folks.
Mike's on his way.
The folks who are participating remotely want to hear.
Okay, great. Hi. So sorry if I am bringing something up that was addressed earlier. I missed the first half hour. But can you talk about soil carbon generally and how it relates to your technologies? Sequestering carbon in soils.
Right. So we had a partnership with a algae-based company that is going through some recapitalization at the moment, probably the right way to describe it. But where what Cici talked about, the advantages of not having to kill the cow, right? In this process, they end up killing the cow. That is, they grow algae, and in the process of harvesting the fuel from it, they're left with biochar. 20% of the carbon that cycles around is in the form of biochar. And so we look forward someday with that company, and still do, someday to advertise on the internet or in the papers and say, drive your car to save the planet. Because then you would have in a single process, you would have something that had closed the loop in terms of taking CO2 from the air, releasing it when it was combusted, but at the same time, a fraction of that you took from the air would be put into biochar, and you could use it for fertilizer, right? And so biochar is, as you know, is one, maybe not know, many of you may not know, they're one of the finalists in the Virgin Prize, as are we, and that
Peter, what's the Virgin Prize? Maybe.
Oh, that's something that it's called the the Earth Challenge, where he's going to give $25 million to a technology that can remove 1 gigaton, has the potential to remove 1 gigaton or 10 gigatons of carbon. So all I'm trying to say, biochar is a viable. There are 2 or 3 winners in the Virgin finalists that are pushing biochar. It does fertilize the soil, right? And so that is a potential sequestration mechanism that has the CCUS component. That is, you can make money in terms of providing a fertilizer while at the same time sequestering carbon. I don't know if you're answering a more general question about soil carbon, but one of the real things that is it's a little bit of a thing, but it's another part of this thing we're trying to come to grips with, our understanding of the threat we face. I've argued for a long time that unfortunately the climate community has presented the wrong metaphor for the threat we face. They're talking about worrying about 1, 2, or 3 degrees temperature rise, worrying about whether the sea level rise is going to be 1 meter or half a meter, where in fact we don't know what it's going to be. And the real threat is that you enter some temperature range where the vast amount of carbon that's stored in the permafrost, or the vast amount of carbon that's stored in the ocean, gets released catastrophically, the so-called tipping point. And so what I tell people in my class is, I have a house in California, and I pay insurance money in case the earthquake comes. I was willing to spend a certain part of my income to protect my asset. And I think actually it would have been a much easier way to sell this to people, to say, look, there is, and it's real, there's a potential catastrophic version of this thing. And if we don't limit the level of CO2 into the atmosphere below, I think the number is 450 that's agreed upon, we are encouraging the risk of not having just a little bit of climate change, but having a catastrophic climate change that would basically devastate the global economy and the global welfare. And I feel that one of the reasons that we've had trouble getting traction is that the person in the lay public, they wake up in the morning, they turn on the TV, and they go to their weatherman, and the weatherman tells them, it's going to rain in 5 days. And 50% of the time, they're wrong. And then they hear some climate scientists say, I'm going to tell you what the climate's going to be 50 years from now, and they say, you're nuts, right? Just intuitively. How can you be, with any confidence, try to predict what the climate's going to be in 50 years? However, if you tell them, I don't know what it's going to be in 50 years, and there are good reasons when I look back in the history of the planet to say that if the CO2 gets above 450, we could trigger this catastrophic melting of the ice caps, the release of the enormous amount of carbon in the permafrost, and have something that would devastate all your lives. I think that would have been a better way to present the problem. So in these big issues for society, having to come with different paradigms of thinking about things, I think we've made, as I said, we made the false analogy with the acid rain, and we made the false, in my opinion, judgment of pushing it based on average changes rather than the concern about the fact that we're playing Russian roulette with the only home we have, and it could be catastrophic, and we'll all say, oh, how do we regret it, but it will be too late.
If I could merge your answer to something Sissy said related to the Valley of Death, to your question, which had to do with soil as a means of sequestering carbon. Well, the planet's done a very good job of that for a long, long time. And Peter has alluded to feedback loops. We've all heard of feedback loops, and we know of a bunch of them, the albedo effect, and we could run through a bunch. Soil is a big one because as it dries, it gives up the carbon that it's holding. And this is most easily observed in bogs and peat, where a huge amount of carbon is stored on the planet. And this has been observed and measured in England. And effectively, if we do reach that point where what we're seeing in terms of methane release in the Arctic and in Siberia, where that actually accelerates, and then is added to the effluent that we create, then I think, and this I believe is from a scientist, Sissy started out using words that come from a background of study, and then she sprung to a biblical line with the Valley of Death, and that's what we're talking about here. So, we're engaged in capturing carbon out of the air, not utilizing soil. And we're pretty good at it, and we're good enough to feed growth environments, plant growth environments. But there's one thing we know that we have to do, and this is, I think, what's been at the root of Klaus's work and Peter's work and certainly Jim Hansen's efforts, is to figure out a way to take a lot out fast. And we're not there yet, but our ability to feed plants in greenhouses will inform us so that hopefully when things do get worse, we'll have the ability to take a lot out fast. And hopefully by then, the government here and the government in Canada and in other places will have found places to put it. That's a lot of ifs. And it requires all of these balls to stay in the air. We need Joule to succeed. We need them to create what is effectively a carbon neutral fuel. We need to take the Netherlands offline in terms of carbon feeding of all the greenhouses that they have and make it carbon neutral, captured right out of the air. We need to do that. So you've got here a bunch of iterative steps, step by step, to try and address a problem that's almost inconceivably big.
Again, the irony for me is that if we took a significant fraction of the amount of money and the amount of R&D they're investing to clean up flue gas, this problem would go away, right? We're not talking about a big price tag. We're spending that money on the wrong solutions today, and if there was a willingness to acknowledge that and redirect those same funds I believe that you would see remarkable progress. Because if you think about it, as I said, the history about technology development is always about learning by doing. The more effort there is, the lower the cost is. And up on the stage, we may have, of course, we haven't spent anything like $200 million, but that's a separate issue. But let's say in total, there's been $1 billion spent on air capture. I can tell you between Kraus, myself, and it's probably been under 30 million or 40 million at most, right? So that you have the efforts of 3 or 4 or 5 people on the planet, right, with their private investors spending $50 million and getting in the realm where you can see that there's a promise. It's not like they're starting out 10,000 times too costly. They're not starting 1,000 times. They're not even starting 10 times too costly, right? Some of them may be 1 or 2 times, twice as costly. We're even believing some of them now are even economically viable. And so for a relatively little amount of money, the system is primed to do the demonstration. Yet it's so locked up, right, that getting even that small movement is extremely difficult. And that's the way it is.
Thanks, Peter. Just to answer your question, and then I'd like to give the panelists final remarks,
right,
and I'll give my final remarks as well. Soil carbon's critical for negative emissions, and air capture is critical for negative emissions. And what we need to think about when we're talking about negative emissions is mobilized versus immobilized carbon. And when we take fossil-based energy out of the ground and burn it, we're mobilizing that carbon that before was immobilized. And when we pull carbon dioxide out of the air and try to mineralize it, which I think is a long-term goal of air capture, we're immobilizing it. And when you look at the carbon that exists within soil carbon or all the trees or the surface ocean, that's CO2 that has a natural balance and a flux. So to go back to something that I know that you weren't here for because you came late, which is the technological fix. And this is a great paper that Daniel Sarowitz wrote in Nature in 2008 that says if we can be unambiguous in our footprint, and really unambiguous means that we know how much CO2 we're pulling out. And I think with soil carbon, your accounting gets a little bit squishy. So if you're unambiguous and you can scale and satisfy those 2 criteria, you're able to really talk about this is the capture of last resort. And with that, I'll say this is sort of my closing remarks, that we don't have a choice but to engage this technology. It's not a question of if, but when. And I think the sooner that we can put dollars to work in accelerating the investment here, the better of a hedge we'll have against a climate catastrophe. And by that, I mean, maybe half of our country who thinks that humans aren't causing climate change might wake up one day and be like, wow, we really need to do something and we need to do it fast. Well, if the technology's not there to do it, we can't. So starting today is a wise investment. Final remarks?
So I guess some final remarks. A couple of years ago, there was a small physicist conference in Columbia, and I crashed it. I said, can I crash as a non-physicist? And they were going to focus on climate change. And they wanted to be a small group because they were talking about data, and they had a psychologist up there. And they were talking about, the psychologist was telling physicists how to speak to the general public. And I was taking these notes I was just telling you about the 500 gigaton problem. It's 2/3 in the air. And the psychologist was saying, if the public actually understands what you're saying, they'll be depressed. Because most people don't, because they'll give up. And I sort of tried it on my family and my wife, and they all went, yep, okay, it's over. What are you going to do with this? Because I think most people don't, once they really understand that 500 billion cubic feet is going up, and that rate is actually increasing. In the US it's decreasing, but if you look at China and the rest of the country, it's increasing. But I am an optimist, and my final point is that I think this technology, it will eventually be used. There may be many uses for it. There's going to be a portfolio. You're going to have companies who produce fuel from it. Some people, like utilities, may get involved. So I am an optimist, but I see that as sort of inevitable, where some form of air capture will be utilized to, the way I think of it is, years ago, 40, 50 years ago, we cleaned rivers, right, if you dump chemicals in it. So this will eventually take that similar concept. We're going to clean up the mess that we created over the last 100 years and pull that CO2 that we've been putting in over the last century, and I'm optimistic we'll find a way to do it.
So I think to Peter's point earlier about the status of his company's technology, of having a line of sight, as I understand, to about $50 per ton of CO2 capture from air. That is already at a level that is, that wasn't predicted before by most scientists or economists or, in the business sector. So if we had that kind of cost competitive CO2 source and married it to a technology like Joules, where, in fact, Joule, one thing I should mention is that we don't actually require very high concentration of CO2. So in the case of CCS, where you hear, $50 to $100 of a ton of captured CO2, that is at very, very high concentration in order to be able to put that underground. So if we can just enrich the air slightly to use it in a distributed fashion, intermixed between our plant, we could actually have a solution that is very scalable and feasible in the medium term. Again, I think in the short run, we might have to do something with industrial source of CO2, but perhaps if the technologies represented here are a little, maybe we need to talk about it and understand it a little bit more, but if it is feasible in the short term, it's something that we could try out and start to utilize sooner rather than later. But the point is that we know that such technologies could enable the scaling of technologies like Joules to utilize CO2 and create a lot of value for society. And we believe that it's just a matter of time that this will happen. And so again, to kind of add on to Don's positive image, I'm an optimist as well, otherwise I wouldn't be here. It is a future that we can try to embrace and can look forward to, but it does require working together in industry as well as with multiple actors from various sectors.
I was recently, almost a year ago now, in London to hear Al Gore speak, to hear David Blood speak, who started Generation Investment. And at that conference, Paul Pullman, who runs Unilever, spoke. And Unilever, as you know, makes soaps and cosmetics and creams. And they've sourced oil palm, or palm oil from oil palm trees for many, many decades to make that, and have invested in improving oil palm growing to diminish the need to eradicate more rainforests to get more oil palm as they grow their markets. In the past year, they've exited the oil palm raw material business and are focusing on oils from other plants. He closed his comments in one of the most beautiful speeches I've ever heard, and you should look it up on YouTube. Just look up Paul Pullman, P-O-L-M-A-N. He said something that had a lot of different edges to it, and he said, it's too late to be a pessimist. In other words, we don't have any option. It's just too late to be a pessimist. And the fact is that so far we haven't done our job. And who would tell us that? Well, Thomas Jefferson would. He would have, had he not been edited out to this day in the Constitution. Because what he wrote in the original Constitution was that we are to hand over the earth in this country to our sons and daughters in usufruct. What does that mean? That means that we're supposed to hand it off in as good shape as we got it. And we haven't done that. Things are a little rougher. But we are blessed with science. We are blessed with the capacity to live full lives, remarkable lives, in a modern world with food and water and energy. and get it from the air. And yes, we can get it for less than $50 a ton. And yes, we can marry our technology to your technology and enable Joule to flourish. So there is reason for hope, and lots of reason for hope. And just personally, I want to say that your presence here is encouraging. Thank you.
So I'll be very brief. As I said, I teach a course in Columbia about closing the carbon cycle. And as I told you, I'm clearly an optimist, otherwise I wouldn't be doing this. I certainly wouldn't be doing it at my age. But what I always tell my class is the following. I know one thing. I know we can solve the problem. But I don't know how bad we're going to have to get whacked before we do so. And I think that's really the issue. How far are we going to have to go before the crisis deepens, before the deniers are not, it's no longer arguable, all the self-interests that are resisting can no longer resist because the situation has gotten so bad. And I think all of us are trying to fight the good fight to try to make it possible for the system to get the message before we get whacked, right? But we will get whacked if we don't get the message. So that's where it is. I mean, and that's why we're holding sessions like this, and that's why we're all trying to make an effort. Can we develop enough effort, enough progress, make a plausible enough argument to the decision makers to say, look, do we have to wait till we get whacked before you recognize that putting some public money into something that the Defense Department thinks is a national security threat makes sense? And the minute they do that, I'm saying there's been enough progress and this problem is not as difficult as solar was, right, to begin with. We happen to have jumped on the learning curve in a pretty amazing place. I'm always shocked, actually, how little effort we've got to ourselves into a relatively good place on the learning curve. So once the system recognizes and is willing to invest some resources, and to me, it's not even dollars. I like all those bright minds at the DOE laboratories trying to solve this problem, rather than trying to solve a problem that won't solve the threat we face. So that's the way I look at it, and I hope we do get the message before we get whacked.
Wow, thank you. That was a lot in 2 hours, a great deal to digest and take in. So to help you with that digestion, we have some refreshments outside, which we hope you can partake in. The panelists will be around. I want to thank the panelists. I want to thank Heather Romero and Ellen Cook. I want to thank our audio team for being here and allowing this to live stream. I want to thank the audience and the audience that's out in the Ethernet, another miracle of all miracles. But let's have another round of hands for the panelists.
Pleasure as usual.
You're wonderful. Thanks so much.